there, fellow meeples. Welcome to another episode of Unqualified Experts. I'm your host, Braden Gardner.
Shane Dayton, your corrupt overlord.
And today we're going to be talking about some strategies for what you should be looking for when you're placing your first and second settlements in Settlers of Catan, the base game.
Yeah, the starting points, if you're the first player to go and there's an obvious premium spot, you don't need our coaching to tell you to grab it. They're usually ones that stick out. And if you're new to the game, look for the spot of the board every single other player is staring at when it's your turn. That's a pretty good sign. But the early placements can matter so much, whether you have a good game against competitive players or you just kind of doom yourself to the Shadow Realm from the beginning. And so there are a few different strategies we wanted to go over because there are many different roads to victory, and sometimes those roads are made of sheep.
Or other things. Who knows?
And so the first part to think about, really, the first strategy I want to talk about is looking at road building when you set up. And for me, Brian, there's two times this really comes up with the board. Sometimes, like this one, there is exactly one spot where you can see brick and wood together. And if there is only one spot like that on the board, and they're good numbers, it's really tempting just to grab that.
Even if they're mediocre numbers, I'd still say that barring 3, 11, and 12, you probably still want it.
Yeah, because early on, anyone who's played this game knows bricks are at a premium early on because there's only so many areas you can expand to, and once they're gone, they're gone. And so if you can grab one or two extra settlements early on, or cut someone else off from theirs, that's huge. Aside from seeing like the one spot, the other time this pops up a lot is if you put down your first settlement and then you're coming back around and you have to put down your second and there's not necessarily a premium place left. At that point, almost anywhere where you can grab a road, especially since you get those resources right away for placing the second settlement, having that free road right off the bat I've seen that end up deciding games. And so those are the two times where I think you really have to look at road building as a viable part of your setup strategy.
Absolutely. But sometimes the board isn't going to go your way for that. Sometimes you're just not going to have viable options that allow you to crisscross the board with ease, barring an unusually cooperative trade partner. So if you aren't able to necessarily road build, then finding a place where you can get some cities set up early is not a bad way to go if you feel like you're stuck in one spot. Looking for places where you've got access to plenty of wheat and plenty of stone. Plus, if you're locking down those areas, odds are you're not going to be the most popular trade partner early in the game, but you're definitely going to have more people reaching out to you as the game progresses.
Yeah, and especially late game, you may find that you go up to 2 cities pretty quickly, but if you grabbed a bunch of stone and wheat, you might be lacking resources like brick or wood, which you need for towns and roads. However, as everybody else is looking for cities, and you're the only person on the board, you can get some really, really good trades that can help you do your little bit of expanding towards the end. I also like that because it's 2/3 of a development card, and those can be game-changing.
For sure.
Which brings me to my favorite strategy. It's a hard one to pull off because very, very rarely do you find a good, what we call development card spot that the first player doesn't immediately grab. Like the Red City there can attest to, when you have a good number on sheep, stone, and wheat all meeting in one place, you grab that. That's kind of obvious because we all know how powerful those cards can be. Another strategy to look at some point would be maybe you can't get them all in one spot. But like green over here trying to get a piece of everything. They have sheep and stone over there. They have wheat over here. And with 2 settlements, they can spread out so they still have the ability to get some of those cards. And that's one thing where if you have 2 of the 3 early on, you may just want to take a slightly less overall quality spot and take a spot that has a really good number on that one missing resource.
Now, for those who aren't necessarily familiar with what development cards can do for you, there are a variety of helpful benefits that you can draw from the deck. You can get soldier cards, which are some of the most common, which will allow you to basically move the robber to a space of your choosing and then plunder from someone who has a neighboring settlement or city. 3 of those will get you the largest army card, which is pretty handy for closing out a game. But you can also get access to tools to help make expansion easier for yourself. Something as innocuous as road building will give you 2 free roads.
Yep.
Year of Plenty will give you 2 free resources. Or if you just want to screw everyone at the table over equally, there's always the Monopoly card, which lets you name a resource and claim every copy from the table.
Yeah, you can still go to hell for that last game.
I can't help that I drew back-to-back Monopolies.
I lost 17 resources in 2 turns.
It was an accident?
He built 3 cities in 1 turn with what he stole from me.
We're efficient?
Okay, so in the interest of avoiding a manslaughter charge, we're going to go ahead and move on. One that I always used to try, and I'm actually not as big a fan of the strategy now, but I have seen people do it well, is placing 2 settlements to try to get get 1 on every resource. Or even starting out, you at least have the chance to get anything on the board. Usually this means you have like a 2 or a 12, or at the very least a 3 or 11, because good players are going to take up the really good spots. But the advantage to that one is obvious. You are probably going to be the only player who has settlements on every resource in the beginning. That's really hard to pull off. And considering, you need 4 of the 6 resources for a town, you need 3 for a development card, you need 2 different ones for a city. The ability to have any of those at any given time makes you a good trade partner. It also makes you more likely to back into that lucky card. It's tough to do. I'm not sure once you get used to playing it's always the best strategy. But especially on a board with a lot of mediocre, where you just don't know what's going to come up, that's not a bad way to go.
For sure. And this is a strategy that I feel personally is a lot friendlier to newer players who are kind of starting to get into learning how Catan's ins and outs actually work. This is a good way to kind of make sure that you're covering your bases and you're going to put in a solid showing, though very infrequently have I found that it's actually going to help you put in a winning showing.
Oh, Harbor Master, would you like to give the intro to this?
Oh, sure. So, I've been known a time or two to go all in on a certain strategy, particularly if I end up being the last person to place, as I get to set my placements up back to back. So, this is a feast or famine strategy where you basically are looking at setting up on one of the 2-to-1 harbor ports and then getting as many resource tiles of the resource that your harbor is on as possible. So there are a couple different ways that you can go about that strategy here. Sometimes you'll luck out and you'll have a really close harbor that you can work with. Say, like Brown has here with the wood harbor. You've got 3 different wood tiles that are basically situated really nicely on the wood harbor, and you could easily set up your first and second placements to be here and here, and have access to the 4 and the 8 really easily. Or if you wanted to go a little farther afield, you could easily set yourself up on the 8 here and the 6 over there, and let probability do your dirty work for you. But you may not have easy access to a harbor. Your resource tiles may not end up sandwiched next to the harbor itself, in which case you're going to be setting up to do a strategy where you've got one of your settlements on an appropriate port and the other one snagging ideal tiles across the board. This can either be really good for you or really bad because it makes you very, very easy to cut off in places. But by the same token, you may not need to go anywhere if you can just trade for whatever resources you want.
It's kind of the Brett Favre Catan strategy. You either throw a touchdown or you throw an interception. There's really no middle ground. Blue is kind of an example of that on this board because the setup there, the first town which goes to a city, it's nothing but sheep. And so the second setting is on the sheep harbor. So there's less numbers, there's less access to resources early on. But man, if that 8, 5, and 11 starts hitting, it doesn't matter because that player will be able to make anything they need.
For sure.
And usually for that is normally someone who is placing fourth. Because I know in our games, if I see someone put down a settlement like that, or in this case had someone put one in the 3 stone there, somebody is blocking that other spot. Like, I will give up a slightly better settlement area to make sure they don't get the appropriate harbor. That's just smart move.
Exactly. And that's part of the tricky part with placing is you not only have to make sure that you're considering your own strategy, you also have to be reading what your opponents are doing to see whether it's more advantageous for you to go all in on your plan, or maybe it might be worth it to spend one of your settlement picks disrupting a potentially dangerous plan that your opponents are showing on the board. And that's where one of my trademark strategies comes into play, and that's hate drafting. So basically, let's say you've got blue there who's telegraphing their sheep, much like Shane mentioned before. It might well be worth putting a second pick down on the sheep harbor to shut that plan down.
Instead of doubling up right away, he would do that, and the sheep person could just deal with it.
At which point, they're going to be operating from a pretty severe disadvantage and probably sprinting for the nearest 3-1 port that they can get their hands on to try and salvage the plan.
Yeah, and a good question to ask, especially if you're in one of the unfortunate middle positions. Because look, if you draft first, you're probably you should be getting the best spot on the board, and then you probably are not going to have much choice in the last spot, just because of the way the drafting works. If you're the fourth person, you get to set your strategy because you're the one person who gets to put up your cities back to back, which is why a lot of harbor plays happen during that time. Or someone who grabs the last brick and wood because they can grab the last early road. But if you're in one of those middle sections where a lot's up to chance, that's a time where a good question to ask yourself is what's going to be left. It's not just always about the best numbers on the board, but if there's only one spot that gives really good wheat, or if there's one spot that gives really good stone, look at grabbing that. Because we've had games where no one paid attention to sheep, because you just don't think about it much. Especially in our games where roads are made of sheep and cities are made of sheep. And we've had games where we watch people turn in 16 sheep to the bank to build something. But in a game, if you're looking at the tiles and, there's a 2 on sheep, and there's a 12 on sheep, and there's an 11, and then there's one decent number like a 5, that 5 is suddenly much more valuable because those other numbers are not going to roll most of the time. And so if in doubt, just ask what's going to be scarce, because that may take a spot that looks just okay, and then you realize, you can cut off the resource from someone else. And that can make a huge difference. Sometimes a middle-of-the-road number on a scarce resource is way better than a good but not great number, but, all that resource has good but great numbers. There are so many more chances to get it on the board.
For sure. And cutting off a resource can definitely put you in a position of power as far as trading and expansion, But it's not the only way that you can put an opponent in a bad spot. You can also set yourself up in such a way that you're basically cutting off their expansion to other places by how you place your settlement. Since you can only place a settlement within 2 spots of another settlement at minimum, if you elect, say, to place directly on the other side of a hex 3 spots away, you've literally just cleaned an entire spot off the board that someone can set a spot down on.
Yeah. And sometimes, instead of taking a great spot, you take the very good one that cuts off all the spots other people might build roads to or are looking at. And sometimes it's worth taking that little bit of a hit where you may lose 1 or 2 resources in a game, but you cut off entire settlements to other players.
This is a strategy that in our group Phil is particularly notorious for, where he will just ruin 3 good spots by
taking the okay one in the middle wall.
as the rest of us just go air at him.
Yep, but he deserves it, every bit of it.
Every bit of it.
And one that we've kind of mentioned a few times, but we talked about it with harbors, but it doesn't necessarily have to work that way. Sometimes choking off a resource can be effective. Like, maybe you can grab 3 wheat or 3 stone and block other people from it, but you can't get the equivalent harbor. I think this works better with some resources than others, because all the resources are needed at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But like late game, brick is pretty useless.
For sure.
Whereas wheat, you need it for development cards, you need it for cities, you need it for towns. If you have a board where you can cut off wheat, that's just a good strategy. You are forcing everyone to go through you, or to spend way more resources with the bank to try to keep up with you. And it's also pretty good with stone, because you need that for development cards, you need it for cities. And so if you just have that weird board where you have an unusual chance to just cut off a resource, even if the harbor is off play, that still might be a good deal, as long as you can get just enough other resources to not drown early on.
Absolutely. And while wheat is going to be the one that's going to be most effective through all parts of the game, don't be afraid to dictate the pace of the early game or the late game, depending on where you think you're going to be able to set yourself up. If you can lock down brick and basically dictate
in the
people's ability to expand early,
who builds roads and who doesn't, chances are you're in pretty good shape in the late game.
And eventually stone operates kind of the same way, because it's key not just for cities but also for development cards, so that's another good one to lock down, especially since both brick and stone only have 3 hexes on the board versus the 4 that the rest of the resources offer.
Yeah. And probably the other thing I would mention is, at least in our games, when you're looking at numbers, 6s and 8s obviously roll the most. But usually, there's always a number beside them that also does well. So if I ever see a spot where there's like a 5 and a 9, 2 numbers that you know will come up quite a bit, I might take a spot that has a 5 and 9 and say maybe a 4, over one where there's a 6 or an 8, but then a 3 and 11. Numbers that they're okay, but they're not going to come up as much. Because a lot of times 2 very good numbers are going to be better than that 1 elite number. And I'm curious to see what your guys' experience are, because in ours, only one of those tends to roll. Either the 8 or the 6 will go cold almost every game we play. And you just don't know which one's going to be.
Kind of similarly with the 5 and the 9 for us. Like, one of those is just ice cold for most of the game, and the other one tends to roll gangbusters.
Kingmaker, yep.
But even if you do everything right, the important thing to remember with Settlers is you can do everything right and still lose.
Yeah.
So monitoring the ebb and flow of the game is going to be important for doing what you can to stay on top of things.
Yep. One meeple who shall not remain unnamed, god damn it, Phil, won off 12s and 2s once. We're not kidding. He literally built 5 towns in a city off 12s and 2s.
We have not seen its like before or since.
It just, sometimes it happens. You know? But when you think strategically on how to set up, especially early game, especially based on what's there, what various strategies you see, where the harbors are, you at least you push the scale your way. You have that much better a chance to come out ahead.
For sure. But now we want to hear from you. What are your favorite strategies for setting up pieces on the board? Is there a particular strategy that you favor over others? And if so, why? Share it with us in the comments below.
Yep. Are you a development card hoarder, or do you like making your roads, towns, and cities out of sheep? Let us know. Let us know your wildest Catan stories, because we all have them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Feel free to support us on Patreon. And much love. Thank you, Meeples.
We'll see you next time.
If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.